Hello, service coordinators. Welcome to the Service Coordinator Podcast. This is Dan Berger. I believe this is episode number 16 of the Service Coordinator Podcast. And if you have not already subscribed to the podcast, please do so. Please leave comments, hit the like button, do whatever you need to do. Helps out the show so we can continue the show, keep it going. So today we are joined by Alexandra Nassau-Brownstone. That's a long name. Gosh.
It is. Good morning.
Alexandra, good morning. Alexandra is the Vice President of Resident Outcomes and Cores at SAHF, Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future. Wait, Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future.
You got it right.
For the future.
That's it. That's why we go by SAHF, because it's a mouthful. And then when you combine it with my name, it's really a long mouthful.
I said it before. I'm like, oh, yeah, for the future. And then I'm like, for the future. So how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
You're good. You're in Washington, D.C.?
Yep. Just outside of D.C. in the little town, Tacoma Park, Maryland.
And how long have you been with SAHF?
4.5 years.
Gotcha. What were you doing before that?
For that, I was working for a local developer here in the DC area, running their resident services program. They operate in DC and Maryland. So I was doing that for about 8 years, overseeing their portfolio of resident services. And before that, I worked for Enterprise Community Partners. They had a National Resident Services Initiative, and I was a support to that team there for about a year.
So is your background social work or go to social work? How'd you
Yeah, great question. I did not. I am not a social worker by trade, by background. I, like so many in the housing world, sort of found myself here. Undergrad, I was, in the DC area, and I designed a major. I sort of couldn't find a right fit. I thought I was going to be a photojournalist, actually. And I wound up building a program, Power and Poverty in the Media. So I was really interested in dynamics of power and giving voice to people who may not have a voice in the traditional media. And then I wound up working for Enterprise and Resident Services, and then for this developer that I mentioned. And then I went back to school for community planning. So it was really about community and how do you use housing as this, the powerful platform that it is to engage with residents. How do you support communities and residents in accessing other kinds of opportunities?
Great. So, so what's the biggest part of your day? What's your day typically look like? Are you working with members? Are you working with HUD, or who do you work with?
So SAHF is, we're a collaborative of affordable housing developers. National Church is one of them. The members work all across the country. SAHF's sort of known as this really, as sort of the meeting of practice and policy. So while we're doing as an organization a lot of federal housing policy work, we are so deeply engaged with our members. So that is what I do day in and day out, is a lot of member engagement. I'm working with sort of the leaders and managers of resident services initiatives for those different groups. And we work outside of the SAHF membership too. So talking with other networks, other practitioners. It's trying to identify different models that are working to support, really robust resident services, and the infrastructure that goes into it. It's thinking about some of the financing solutions to help support resident services. We know that that's one of the greatest barriers always, is finding sustainable financing. I also run our CORES or certification program, Certified Organization for Resident Engagement and Services, which we can talk about later, but there's a lot of engagement in the broader resident services field through that.
Okay. So why don't you go into a little bit more about CORES? What is CORES? What is the certification?
Sure, happy to. So I know it's another mouthful. So CORES, again, is Certified Organization for Resident Engagement and Services, launched a couple of years ago, back in 2018, and it's a certification for an organization. And it's looking at an organization's sort of infrastructure, its capacity, its commitment, to providing a system of resident services coordination. And so I always talk about sort of what do we mean by a system of resident services coordination, because there's the frontline staff, the coordinators, who are absolutely critical to making this work. But there's all that other support that happens to make those people even more successful in their job. And an organization that's really invested in this has invested in that infrastructure. So it's the corporate and regional level staff, quality assurance, the managers, the IT folks that are supporting, the sort of HR functions that are supporting that. It's the partnerships and the programs that you're building. It's the trust building. It's the communication platforms and data management, how an organization is thinking about using community level data and resident demographics and direct engagement with residents to really sort of thoughtfully inform a program plan and to understand, hold themselves accountable to goals that they've set and understand the impact they're having. And so the core certification was built on this framework for a system of resident services coordination that SAHF developed a number of years ago, leveraging a community practice with the members that lays out this systematic way sort of for approaching resident services when and where an organization thinks about providing services that's replicable and scalable, but it's also really resident centered. So it's thinking about what are the specific needs, the priorities that residents have identified, that the organization may also have identified, that drives what resident services look like at any one specific community. So that's sort of in a nutshell what CORS is. So it's that certification that looks at that organizational capacity.
So is there a minimum amount of service coordinators or residents that, I mean, can anybody just go become CORS certified? I mean, I know it's a process, but
it's a process. So it's a 5-year certification. There are a number of threshold requirements. There are sort of 9 thresholds. The application itself is about 50 questions. There are a lot of uploads. So there's a lot of criteria that, if any organization were thinking about pursuing this, they should be doing it. We really feel like most organizations should have been doing resident services for a minimum of 3 years to have built up this sort of infrastructure, because you might have a handful of properties where you maybe inherited a contract, a 202 contract, and you have a stellar coordinator, but that doesn't mean that you've built all this other support around it. So it's, the years of experience, it's having some of these tools that we outline in the certification around using community level data and property data and resident feedback to shape a property services plan, and the use of data to track impact. What else should I say about it? It's been used. We have about a little over 30 organizations certified to date. It's growing. It's being used in a number of different capacities. So Fannie Mae has a program, the Healthy Housing Rewards Initiative, and there's 2 parts of that, but one part of that is what they call the Enhanced Resident Services Initiative, which is financing to support resident services. So this is something we're really excited about, because it's essentially like, I just heard somebody refer to it this way, it's evergreen money. It's a discount that's, included in the initial financing, and that money is good for the life of the financing. So if you get a certain, 20 basis points or 30 basis point discount in the financing, that could translate to anywhere between $30,000 to $75,000, depending on the size of the loan, every year towards resident services to help enhance your existing commitment as an owner to doing resident services. So that's really exciting. And then there are a number of states that use CORS in their QAPs to help allocate tax credits.
Sounds like a better plan than some of the grants out there from HUD and trying to get paid back and when new money's going to come out.
Well, the whole goal is, how do you patch these things together? I mean, the big goal is that you don't have to be creating this patchwork of financing in quite the same way that the field does. But how do you identify a couple of sustainable sources? And this Fannie Mae recognizes that, owners that have built this infrastructure are committed to supporting resident outcomes and the health and, the stability and health and well-being of their communities. So if an organization has, achieved CORS certification, this is part of their business model and mission. And so this is a place where they want to invest because they want, that investment to help support residents. So it's win-win.
Perfect. Why don't you talk to me about, okay, so we're almost 2 full years into the pandemic. What's it look like now for your members? What are you hearing from the field? What do these communities, how do they look different than they did before the pandemic? what's it look like different? And we know that service coordinators and property managers had to work really, really well together to survive this pandemic. What are you seeing? What are you hearing from the field from what we've learned over the last 2 years?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with the property management resident services collaboration piece. I think that's, historically there has been, at times in different teams, there's been friction. One team is sort of traditionally tasked with the operating of the property and the compliance, and the other team is tasked with, supporting residents and resident outcomes and supporting health and well-being. When you would stop and talk to those teams individually, pre-pandemic, this has nothing to do with pandemic, and you talked about sort of what their goals are, 9 times out of 10, they actually identified very similar goals, but the way they would go about it in their day-to-day feels really different. And so for a variety of reasons, lack of communication and different sort of drivers for their work, there would be this friction. So pandemic, hits us all. And I think teams were forced to pivot, and the goals, common goals became so much clearer around supporting residents to stay safe and stay stably housed. And so teams had to communicate more often. Resident services staff was brought in much earlier to talk about families, households, seniors that had been identified that were at risk maybe of losing their housing, or that there was some concern. And so there's a lot of conversation happening right now about how do you take that relationship that's been built, the trust that's been built there, and how do you harness that and keep some of those practices in place, hopefully forever moving forward, where you have these teams really working together. They have distinct roles and responsibilities, but they really can collaborate and see each other as colleagues and team members in a far deeper way. So I think that's been a big piece of it. I think that there's been some conversation about what this means for hiring practices for organizations. Is, we want to continue to hire staff with a skill set that supports the job and the role that they're hired to do. But how do you continue to prioritize some of these interpersonal values and skills, and some, staff that value cultural competencies, and this more collaborative, person-centered, resident-centered, empathetic structure and approach to that work? It's been a big piece of the conversation.
Yeah, I hired service coordinators for 13 years, and I'd put them into clients' buildings, and we go through the resumes and interview the service coordinators, and we would say, hey, here's 3 or 4 qualified candidates that we think that could do the job, but it's all about that service coordinator property manager relationship. And so send those candidates to the property manager, and they get to have a say in who's going to be in their building, who they get to work with, who the residents get to work with. And I always think that's so key. If that property manager service coordinator relationship's not working out, the building's not probably working out too well either.
Yeah.
Especially during the pandemic. I think that's only been brought to the forefront even more. And even in my years in this industry, you can just see the push towards resident services, and it's just not affordable housing anymore. It's using affordable housing as a platform for those services. And I think it's just amazing to see all these organizations and seeing that service coordinators, hey, they need to be in these communities. Before it was like, oh, great, we got a service coordinator, and we're not sure what they're doing, but we got one, but now it's almost frowned upon if you don't have a service coordinator. So
the field was transformed by COVID in that way, that many mission-driven developers, whether certainly it was more prevalent in the nonprofit world, but many for-profits do it too, had some service coordination. That has just exploded. Is that sort of, how are we going to from sort of the most just fiscally responsible, if you're looking at it from that lens, you don't have a viable property and you a cash flowing property if you don't have residents that are stable and able to pay their rent and all of that. So there was just this recognition that to support this field, whether it was purely mission or also business, that there was an alignment, that there really needed to be an investment in service coordination.
Love it. Yeah, I heard today that there's only half of the HUD 202 buildings have service coordinators in them. So tons of opportunity for more service coordinators for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Alexandra,
Absolutely.
is there anything else you'd want to leave the service coordinators with, or call to actions or anything like that before I let you go?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are a couple other things that I would talk about just in terms of sort of top issues that, that we already talked about, the property management resident services relationship. I think like so many fields right now, everybody is dealing with a high level of burnout and exhaustion. I mean, I think that there isn't a conversation that I've had in the last several months, at least, where members, practitioners don't talk about this. And that's on the resident services side, that's on the property management side, that's at every level. And so there's been just sort of a ongoing and growing conversation around mental health supports and self-care. So both what can organizations do to support their staff, support their residents, to feel, that they are stable, that they get their support, the supports that they need. There's a lot of talk about self-care. How does an organization build a culture of self-care? That's really hard. I heard somebody use the term the other day, how do you drink while you pour? If you have nothing, how do you do something for somebody else if you don't have that for yourself?
Right.
And so I think that's one of the things that service coordinators struggle with, is that the pressure to constantly be on, to constantly be available, because sometimes they know that they are the only person in a resident's life that's making sure they're okay. So continuing to have this conversation and build networks, like this podcast, like some of the other supports that you all have built and others are building in the field, is so critically important.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. One of the things that I heard in a recent conversation is that, as organizations think about what they can do for staff, yes, more, increases in salary. Everybody loves that. That makes life easier, right? And in better benefits, paid time off. That's really great. But one of the things that came up over and over again was staff really wanting to feel valued by their leaders and their managers. And that can be hard to do, but they want to be felt, seen and heard. And that's true for residents. So, this happens at so many different levels. So, I think we're still trying to understand how to do that, because some of that has to be built and some of that is organic. But how do you create a culture of sort of this empathetic, courageous leadership where you're also showing vulnerability? And that's for individual people, but also organizations. So I think there's sort of a lot more that we're doing there, but that's an exciting place we're going.
No, I love that. Yeah, it's just one time a year being recognized with an award or a shout out or something like that isn't always enough. So yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining the Service Coordinator podcast. You are more than welcome to come on any other time if SAHF has some news, or if new events are on the horizon. You are more than welcome to come back. And thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. It was great to be with you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks.
All right, bye.